Hi, everyone. I'm here with Cliff Berg, co-founder of Agile 2 Academy. How you doing today, Cliff?
I'm doing great. How are you, Robert?
I'm doing fantastic. What did you see in the marketplace that led you to develop Agile 2?
Where to start? I've been in IT a long time, and I didn't start out in IT. I was a nuclear engineer and then an electrical engineer, and have a degree in operations research also. And I didn't start out to get involved in IT, but I kind of got sucked into it a couple of times. And I created a very successful startup in the mid 90s that grew to 200 people very quickly. And because of that work, I ended up writing some books about that experience. And one of the issues that was very important was how to move quickly. And we were very good at that. And that was before the Agile movement. But we built very reliable enterprise systems, mission critical systems, things that really had to work. So we couldn't afford to move fast and break things. We had to move fast and not break anything. And so I ended up writing this book called High Assurance Design, which kind of was, what we did to make sure we didn't break things as we moved very quickly. We typically would develop an entire product in 3 months. This is the late 90s. So it definitely was at the scale and speed of things today. Of course, tech has changed. But so I got involved in the Agile movement very early on. I ended up connecting with Scott Ambler because he was one of the few people in the community who was interested in the issue of how do you make sure things really work and how do you make sure they're secure. He wasn't just talking about, oh, let's build this and build that and try this. He was talking about, let's do those things, but do it in a way that we're sure it will really work, an enterprise perspective. So that became my lens. And I watched as the Agile community, to my horror, didn't take any interest in those issues. Wasn't really sure what I could do about it, but about 5 years ago, it was actually during the pandemic, I thought this might be a good time because there had been a lot of discussion about a lot of things in the Agile community. And I put together a team of people, 15 people around the world. We created a matrix of the skills we wanted. So this wasn't a random group of people. We created a matrix of skills and then we recruited people. And the skills included things like program management, product design, leadership, business, system engineering, the whole spectrum of things that you need to do hard stuff at scale. And the lens had to be two main criteria where the person had to have shown that they think for themselves and don't just parrot standard narratives. They had to have demonstrated that through prior writing or speaking. And they also had to not be deeply invested in the status quo. So if someone had a training company teaching Scrum, I would have said thanks, but no thanks, because you're too invested in a very established paradigm. So that team reimagined Agile by looking at what was working and what's not working. And that ended up being called Agile 2. And we wrote a book published by Wiley about that. And that's what led to Agile 2. It was really a retrospective oriented approach on why the narratives weren't quite right.
Well, that's fascinating. The research that I was able to put together on Agile 2, the emphasis to me was moving beyond a one-size-fit-all solution. How do you approach understanding a client's unique organizational structure and challenges, and what role you can play in crafting that transformational program for that company that has sought your services?
Yeah, well, you nailed it. It's behavioral. It has nothing to do with frameworks, nothing. Agility and effectiveness have nothing to do with frameworks, including Agile frameworks that have essentially no impact on agility, maybe a negative impact. But what actually makes a difference is the behavior of people, especially people in leadership roles. In fact, the more influence they have, the more impact their behavior has. So the people at the top who have the most influence, a lot of that influence comes through authority. But regardless the source, the people who have the most influence have the highest leverage, they have the most impact on how things work, the kind of culture that is generated through their behavior and their expectations, the incentives they create, the kinds of what they reward, what they tell people they want, the degree to which they're reachable. All those behaviors are what generate or fail to generate true agility. It has nothing to do with team workflows. Nothing.
Right.
Some of the most agile teams I've been on personally were during the 1980s. And they were teams that had no workflow. There was no framework, none. There was a team lead and a bunch of people, and we figured out what to do day to day without any process or any framework. So it has nothing to do with these frameworks.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's inherent, though, in the psyche of an employee, right? Their boss is the directional force within the firm. To have that latitude, I think you kind of feel constraint, right? And it's the tone that the boss or the owner sets that kind of keeps people in a box, right?
Well, it can, or it can be very empowering,
Right.
and that's another thing. The Agile community, I don't want to bash the Agile community because I feel like I'm a member of the Agile community. But, if in order to figure this out and get it right, we have to self-criticize,
Right.
and one of the incorrect narratives is the self-organization and self-management. That's the wrong paradigm. It's the wrong paradigm. What you want is people who are empowered. You don't want to just say, oh, you all figure it out and step away. That's chaos. That's not leadership. Good leadership is setting expectations. It's asking questions. It's checking in to see how it's going. It's often making decisions saying, okay, you all have discussed this for 3 days. Here's what we're going to do. And I take responsibility for it, but we need to move forward.
Right.
And it's a big risk. So I'm going to take responsibility, but here's what we need to do.
Right.
So it's not about just saying, oh, you all solve that problem and good luck, self-organize, self-manage. That is not leadership. That's abdication of leadership.
Wow, interesting.
Not
You've
that
worked.
that can't ever work. It can work sometimes. That's not a prescription at scale for how to run things.
You've worked with a wide range of clients from Fortune 50 fintech to government agencies. I understand, probably can't share names, but could you give us one or two examples how you've helped organizations redefine their roles into leadership tracks and the benefits, the tangible benefits they've, walked away with?
Well, there's one comes to mind, and that's fairly recent. I mean, there are quite a few over the years, and I have worked with, in my previous work, McKesson Pharmaceutical was a huge client of ours, and we built most of their mission critical systems during that time period. But more recently, there's one company, I'm not going to name them. They're about a $5 billion company. And we helped them realize that they need to replace their agile coach roles with management track roles. And when I say management track, I don't mean the pointy-haired manager. I mean real managers who actually know how to manage, which includes leading. Effective managing includes effective leading. Otherwise, you're a terrible manager. Management is there are different ways of thinking of that term, but if you go to business school, management has 4 components: leading, directing, controlling, and I forget the 4th one, but there are generally 4 components viewed as part of to manage something well. And leading is probably the most important part. So if you're going to create a management track slot for people, you have to think about, are they prepared? Do they have leadership skills? What do we need to do to give them the leadership skills so that they don't become pointy-haired bosses? How do we make them transformational leaders? How do we turn them into inquisitive, approachable, open, thoughtful, supportive leaders? How do we do that? And the way we got to that with that company was we started out, well, first with discussions with their C-level. And there was an executive VP who reached out to me. And we had lunch and we had meetings at his house, actually, with some of his senior people. And then we did a survey. We did a survey that was horizontal and also vertical, a sample of people, and in order to kind of validate what we thought about the culture there. And then based on that, we ran a series of workshops. I think there were 8 of them. I don't know. It's been a few years. We ran a series of workshops to go deep and explore what was really going on, because a survey will give you smoking guns. It won't tell you why. To
Right.
find out why, you really have to talk to people, and you have to talk to them in a safe context where they feel they can speak up. And really, you want to have individual conversations too.
Right.
So we did all that exploratory work, and then we looked at the results, and it was very clear to us what was going on. It was clear as day. And, so we ended up recommending a series of things to them. And one of the major challenges that their agile coaches had was that the role didn't have any authority and had no responsibility. It had no accountability for outcomes. And they all basically were saying, oh my God, we need to be accountable. We want to be accountable. We want to be responsible. We don't want to
Right.
just advise. People aren't taking us seriously enough. We want to have an accountable role. And so we recommended that they convert all those people. They converted most of them. I think they let 2 of them go, but all the rest, 20 some people, they converted them into management track people. That became a role that carries responsibility.
Accountability is so important. I mean, it drives how you approach a circumstance, how you look at an issue, right? Having accountability for that really steps up an individual's game, I believe. And
Yeah.
it's throughout life, right? And any
It's
scenario,
real life.
accountability makes a big difference.
It's real life. And here's another thing the Agile community kind of doesn't understand. They view accountability as someone to punish, and that's
Right.
toxic. If accountability is about punishment, that's very toxic. There's a cultural problem, which has its roots in a leadership problem.
Do you find that
Accountability not about punishment. It's about knowing who to talk to about each issue. There's an issue comes up, and you know who the go-to person is, the person who's on point for that kind of thing. That's what accountability is about.
do you find the punishment aspect of it is more of a generational thing where that type of mindset from the top down displayed itself many, many years ago in like the 50s, the 60s, the 70s,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Because I worked
yeah,
for,
definitely.
yeah, I worked for a company that was 110 years old, and it was a family run organization passed down from the great grandfather to the father to his son and then his son to another son, and being there for just about 30 years, that was definitely, the atmosphere, for lack of a better term, where, you screwed up, you got your hand slapped. So yeah, I was
It's
curious to,
definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, but we have to remember that it's about individuals, and theory Y management was developed in the 50s,
right.
and it's just basically supportive management. So these ideas aren't new. And there was a book I read some years ago called The Rockefeller Habits about Nelson Rockefeller.
Hmm.
And it read like an agile playbook. He was not a top-down autocratic leader. Nelson Rockefeller. So I do think you're right. I do think there was a generational aspect, especially like after World War II, our military had helped save the world, and there
Right.
was this kind of paradigm, oh, that's how you lead things, you give orders. But not everybody was like that. I do think it was widespread. But regardless, the Agile movement was a very normal and positive and predictable backlash against that. But
Right.
as a backlash, it went to the other extreme and failed to interpret the nuance. So accountability went from being, oh yeah, accountability is good, punish anyone who doesn't succeed, to accountability is bad. Anyone who wants accountability is a toxic, pointy-haired boss, and neither is right.
Right.
You do need accountability to scale things, and otherwise you don't know who to talk to about anything. And you also need accountability to really, have who makes the decision is important because teams are terrible at making decisions. And ideally, you do want the team to make decisions and so on, but sometimes leaders have to make decisions. Otherwise, things get stuck. The whole accountability thing is really about being able to move quickly, because
Right.
if people aren't making decisions or they're avoiding the hard decision, you need someone who's accountable to say, okay, well, we've got to make a decision. The clock is ticking. Here's what we're going to do.
Yeah, you can't have that malaise of where you're thinking, rethinking, making sure it's not the wrong decision, right? Sometimes it's just important to make a decision. Not everyone has to agree with it, but it's making that decision to move that ball forward is really important.
Yes. And what's interesting about that is that's what creates psychological safety. There's a misconception that psychological safety is all about accepting failure. And that's not what creates psychological safety. That creates disillusionment. People think, nothing matters. Yeah, it does matter. We don't want to fail. But, if there's a culture of trying things before you dot all the I's, well, we're not sure. Well, let's try and see what happens. And then if that's the culture, what happens then? Half the
Right.
time it will fail.
Right.
And that becomes business as usual. And that's what creates psychological safety. That whole cycle of trying things, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, becomes normalized. But what you're encouraging is not failure, you're encouraging trying things. And then when
Right.
you try something, it doesn't work, you think about it logically. Why didn't that work? Oh, well, let's try this instead. Now we understand it better. That's the thing to focus on. It's not about failure, it's about trying things.
Isn't failure a real critical point in when it comes to growth, right? It's that failure that you build off of to ultimately to have a better outcome. And
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not the thing to focus on
don't be
because
afraid of
if right, if you do fail at something, you failed because you tried something. You took a
it. Right.
risk.
Right.
That's the thing to focus on.
Right. So obviously your philosophy is client skill development for lasting effectiveness. Is it important to you to deliver immediate results and then also empower an organization to sustain their agile maturity long after the experts are gone, have left the room?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can only do that if you really change how people think and change what they
Mm,
know. It's the
right.
behavior, but also knowledge. We
Right.
actually have a model of that we developed. That
Right.
agility results from behavior and knowledge, which generate the culture. So there's a great example. Some years ago, I was asked to help start up a new team and this was a very unagile company, although they thought they were, but really they were not at all. And me and another coach, she was the process coach for not a scrum person, but she was more about them working together well. And we met with the CTO, and this is a very large company. This is a Fortune 50 company. And we
Uh-huh.
met with the CTO, and he said that he wanted this company to do real agile, whatever that was, to do the real thing, to kind of make an example. And so, so I was the DevOps coach. And so there were two of us in that, and there was a project manager. And so we had to pick a project, and we found this new project that was about to start, and we sold this project manager on the idea, and he said, "Go for it." So he had the authority, which was very useful. The agile community also says you don't need management. Well, it was really useful having a manager behind us because we could get meetings and people took us seriously because, well, there's a manager who's accountable for that project, not just two people who have an idea. So the first thing that we did, so I'm going to focus on basically what I did with this because we kind of worked separately. In fact, this particular coach and I really can't be in the same meeting at the same time because she takes over, and I take over. So we worked separately, but very complementary. What we did was we changed what the people knew and how they thought. And the first thing I did was I got everybody in a room, and I don't just mean the team members, I mean the head of QA and also the manager who was going to receive this system to operate it from the business side, and the product owner who was basically in charge of the business requirements, very sharp guy, and the head of testing in this business unit, and all the key people and the analysts who would be assigned to this. And analysts, a really important role, by the way. It's another thing that got thrown out. Really important role, having business analysts, because they understand the details of how things need to work. The product owner understands the vision and worries about partnerships and things like that. Well, someone needs to be down in the weeds and know the details. And, one person can't do all that. They're used to busy people. So I got them all in a room and I asked them questions. It was inquisitive. I said, well, how are we going to build this? And how are we going to make sure that it works? And how, I had a lot of questions because I've built lots of things. So I know what matters. And I just asked question after question. We came up with a table of the kinds of tests, and the table was sparse. We hadn't filled everything in. We just filled in a few things, but we came up with a table that had the kinds of tests that we needed in like a broad category, like we needed resiliency tests, and we needed performance tests, and we needed functional, behavioral tests, and we needed integration tests. So because they started out saying, oh, we need SIT tests, meaning system integration. I said, no, that's specific to an environment. What generically kind of test is it? What's the purpose of the test? Well, the test for integration. Okay, so we want tests for integration. So we had these generic categories. And then we took that table and we put it on the front of the main web page of the SharePoint site for that team. That was where they put all their stuff. And over time, we fleshed it out and we created those. And I had many, many coffees with the head of QA to explain to her how we wanted to work. And I ended up spending literally half my time going around talking to other managers who set rules, explaining to them how we wanted to work and why what we wanted to do would satisfy their concerns. Because their rules always were designed to address some worry or some concern. So I would explain, connect the dots, how what we were doing would still satisfy that concern. As a result, we were always told, okay, and we didn't have to change any rules. Once they understood, they realized it was actually compliant with the rule. It was just different how we were going to do it. Like, for example, we wanted to deploy in a cluster, a container cluster, which was new in this organization. They only had a prototype cluster run. And I said, we want to use that. And it was an OpenShift cluster. And so we got permission to use that because it was in the production environment. It was a solid cluster. And we were told we can't create our own deployment architecture. I said, no, we need to. So once I explained and we agreed that we would work collaboratively with the person who was in charge of that, and we would be able to actually change the design of the deployment. And that way, we got full access to it, and people could run in a test setting. They could run a test cluster and run the same deployment template. And so they could test things locally that had the same architecture as what would be deployed in production. That was unheard of there. And you know what?
Yeah,
we did all that in just 3 months.
Wow.
In
That's
3
invaluable.
months, we did everything. This is people who had no skills in that. I brought in a Red Hat for a day to train them in OpenShift. I trained all the analysts too, non-programmers. The analysts on their laptops created clusters. I got the analysts training in behavioral development, Cucumber. The analysts wrote some test programs. One of the analysts liked it so much, he started writing test programs. The person in charge of QA, she changed, instead of creating a bureaucratic testing phase, she found 3 test programmers for us who would write end-to-end test scenarios, behavioral test scenarios. And those test scenarios were run by the teams to supplement the story level tests. And that way, when we deploy things, we knew the thing friggin' worked.
Right. Your success rate went through the roof. Yeah.
We became very quickly treated like a rock star.
Right.
After 3 months, that team was famous throughout the company.
And it's also just the confidence building you were able to procure
Yes,
doing
and
testing, right?
that closes the loop on what prompted this. Well, you mentioned where it persisted. So the product owner, his name was Brendan. I'm not going to give a last name. He works somewhere else now. But about 2 years after that, because I was only there for 6 months, I figured that the job's done. And I went on to another because I was a consultant.
Mhm.
And it's 2 years later, he messaged me on LinkedIn and said, "We just got audited by McKinsey as a DevOps audit. And that team you created, they identified as the only team that was doing real DevOps." So
Wow.
2 years later, years after I had left, they were still doing that.
Wow. It's impressive.
Yeah. But you know what? The organization was not able to replicate it.
Wow, that's interesting.
They weren't able to replicate it. And so it got treated as like, oh, that's some weird special case. We don't know how they did that, but we don't know. They
You're
weren't
right,
able to
right,
replicate it because they didn't understand how it was done.
right,
Their mindset was you define a process and roll that out. And that's not what we did.
right. Oh, you came at it differently.
I taught
Wow.
them. I taught them these techniques. I never told them to do anything. I
Right.
taught them
Taught
how to
them the
do it.
framework. Right.
I taught them
Wow,
the
that's
ideas.
that's so powerful. So obviously, technology's just grown so much. One of the things I I viewed personally, um, what COVID was going to do to this country was going to be the catalyst, not only for the biggest technological advancements and boom since the 90s, the dot com. And, it's gotten a few things right in my life. My wife being one of them, and sizing up COVID as it relates to technology, and I think we can all agree, what you and I think the role AI is going to be in the next 5 or 10 years. We're probably completely wrong. I don't think anyone really knows. So, looking forward, the trends that you see over the next few years, I'd like you to speak about that. And then, how are you preparing as an organization for that future?
Well, when we discuss that among our partners, there are 5 partners in Agile
Okay.
Academy where, we've spent the last couple of years creating 2 products and testing them with people. We've done a lot of consulting in order to keep going, but really we're focused on these products, which we're about to launch.
Sure.
One is a leadership program, and that's very unlike other programs. And it's designed for everybody, not just the C-level people. And the other product is a tool that lets you manage instead of managing tasks, you manage expectations, you manage key results, goals, and things like that. And so it's a whole different approach to managing things, managing work.
Mhm.
But when we talk about where things are going, I always say, are we talking about the next 12 months, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, or the next 10 years?
Mhm.
Because they're all completely different.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
AI has accelerated because a lot of money has been put into it. So I don't want to talk about 10 years from now. Because as you said, it's hard. I do have ideas on where things are going. I've written some articles about it. I think we can project some things because the trends are pretty clear. But in terms of the next year, 2 years, and 5 years, I think that there is going to be a lot of disruption. Right now we're discovering that the current AI that we use, the current generation of AI systems that people know about are these large language model systems that are based on the transformer architecture, which was a breakthrough a few years ago. AI is a series of breakthroughs. It's not a
Mhm.
continuous thing. It's a series of jumps, and a transformer will be replaced. But the AI of the future is not one model. It's a combination of models, just like Google Gemini is a pair. Our brain is a combination of many different neural networks linked together in a very complex way. It's many neural networks. And so
Mhm.
real future AI will be multiple models. But I think, people have discovered that the current popular architecture, this transformer architecture, is really good at certain things and really terrible at other things. And one of the ways it's terrible is you can't trust it. So there was some research recently that pointed that has a lot to do with the way that we train it. But still, so it's not there yet,
No,
but it will. It
it
will
will.
get.
Yeah,
It
I
will
think.
get there.
Yeah, I think there's obviously framework that has to be put around it, worldwide. But I think if you're going to strike a perfect chord, it's the relationship between human interaction with the support of AI. People are people. We still want to talk to another person. We want to make that sale or we want to make that point to another person. And people who can, especially in the business world, integrate AI to complement them, to help them, to speed it up, so we're able to, as a business, as a human being, be able to do things faster, better, more efficient. I think that's like the perfect chord you can strike with AI. It's not relying on AI, right? They're coming out with
Well,
studies, especially with children, that you know people who just rely on AI 100% of the time and don't challenge it or don't read it, actually their brain development becomes less and less. You actually have a smaller brain, right? And I think that's the fear in a lot of people. So
well,
yeah,
that will
it's
inevitably happen for a large portion of the population. It won't
yeah,
happen for everybody because some people are curious and want to think. The
right,
majority of people, unfortunately, don't want to think. And so
exactly.
that will happen for them,
Yeah,
but there will be those who do want to think and they will be empowered by AI. But, one thing that strikes me about it is, if a manager is making a decision, can I replace people with AI? That the day when they decide that they can replace people with AI is also the day when managers can be replaced by AI.
right.
So,
Well,
yep,
I think the
so we should
country's
be careful what we ask for.
yeah, I think the country has bigger issues when that day comes, right? I think Elon Musk, as he looked forward, he viewed the country at some point. I don't think, you and I will see it, where there's universal income across the entire country, right?
Well,
Just because,
David Sachs was asked about that, and I completely want to avoid politics here. So I'm just
yeah,
reference him because he is our current president's AI advisor. And
right,
David Sachs was asked about whether or not there would be basic income because of AI or whatever. And he said, not going to happen.
huh? So
Not going
there's
to
a
happen.
distinct, yeah,
So,
there's two sides to every belief. Yeah, so it's interesting. It definitely fascinates me. So, in closing, I'd like to ask, what do you feel Agile 2 does very well? And then the converse of that is, what do you guys feel that you're not necessarily struggling with, but you don't do as well and you need to do better?
well, I want to make it clear that my company is Agile 2 Academy, which is separate from Agile 2. Agile
Okay.
2 was the 15-person initiative to reimagine agility. And Agile
Uh-huh.
2 Academy is a commercial entity of 5 partners that helps organizations. We
Hmm.
don't actually use Agile 2. We were inspired by Agile 2. What we
Right.
use is we use the research that exists in leadership and cognition and behavioral psychology, and plus our collective experience in leading organizations and helping organizations. We're a group of very experienced people. One of our partners, Dave Richards, was a co-founder of the MIT Innovation Lab. Stephen Villascusa was a senior executive at Raytheon and has done a lot of consulting, helping organizations transformation. Our strength, I think, is in helping with strategy that generates agility and effectiveness. We're not
Hmm.
very good at marketing ourselves, but mostly like word of mouth. So I'm hoping to change that. We actually have some things on our way that might help change that. But I think our core strength is in what we actually do. When we do work with people, what we actually help them to realize, and help them to do, I think that's our core strength.
That's awesome. Cliff, I want to thank you for this conversation. I felt it was great. There's a lot of great points. Conversation was fascinating, and I truly thank you for your time. And I believe our listeners are gonna benefit from this, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Robert.